Join former FBI senior forensic examiners Becky Passmore and Stacey Eldridge as they dig into the world of digital forensics, one bite at a time. Now leading their own consulting firms and educating the next generation of cyber sleuths. These badass babes of digital forensics bring sharp insight, real-world case experience, and a dose of humor to the bits and bytes that build today's investigations. From deep dives into business email compromise and ransomware attacks, Becky's specialty, to cracking the complexities of iPhone forensics, Stacey's obsession. This podcast delivers insider knowledge for professionals, students, and true crime techies alike. If you've ever wondered what really happens when the digital trail is all that's left, tune in and start parsing the truth.
Welcome back to Parsing the Truth, one bite at a time, where we discuss the facts and what they mean in today's digital investigations. I'm your host, Stacey Eldridge, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Becky Passmore. This week, we're headed back to Australia to continue our discussion on the mushroom murders, the Aaron Patterson case.
That's right, Stacey. And we have a special guest with us tonight. We have Dr. Matthew Sorell with us, and he provided the expert testimony on the cellular location data in this case. So thanks for being with us tonight.
Okay, my pleasure. Well, I don't know whether I'm going to speak with an Australian accent or an American accent. I did my PhD at George Mason, so we'll see how we go. So if my accent slips, you'll know what's going on.
So, Dr. Sorell, other than that little tidbit you already gave us about George Mason, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you've done, and then what you testified about in this case as an expert witness?
My background is that I actually studied electronics engineering as distinct from a computer science or informatics type of background. That was back in the 90s. I worked in defense. I came over to the States, did my PhD in information technology, statistical signal processing, really, in that defense context at George Mason. Came back to Australia and jumped into the telecommunications sector. This was 1998, and ended up doing a lot of consulting with Australian telcos, with a lot of Asia-Pacific telcos, particularly at that commercial level. I ended up doing Vodafone Australia's internal training and applying that electronics engineering and radio systems engineering background. I then joined faculty here at the University of Adelaide, teaching telecommunications engineering. 2005, might have been 2006. I was approached by a defense barrister here about some digital photographs from these newfangled digital cameras that we didn't really know much about, and realized there was a gap in knowledge. That started my interest in what I'm going to call digital forensic science as opposed to digital forensic analysis. And the distinction I make here is that the artifacts that we find in the digital domain are more than just logs on a computer. And there's a lot of research effort into access and acquisition. There's a lot of research effort and standard operating procedure about preservation of evidence. There's not a lot about what does this artifact that has come from a sensor, which has then been measured, interpreted, summarized, measured again, interpreted, summarized, and exported. What does that tell us about the real world? And that applies to cameras. It applies to radio signals. It applies to accelerometers and step counts and so on. So over the last 10 years in particular, that has really accelerated. South Australia police here brought me in for the Myrna Nielsen murder, where she was wearing an original generation Apple Watch. And this was the first time that we're aware of globally where we have a homicide victim wearing a watch which captured all of the movements of her fatal assault. And so that was really critical. But no one had looked at it before. None of the tool vendors were examining the health database at that point. And it was nearly a year later I presented that at an international conference. A couple of the vendors were present and they updated their tool the next week. So that was nice to have that impact. South Australia Police then realised that I actually knew something about telecommunication networks and the cellular networks here in Australia. And so that started to snowball. I was also appointed as the scientific advisor to a European project called 4Mobile. So that looked at mobile phones from crime scene to courtroom, building European standards and training for European law enforcement. So I have a bit of a wide geographic spread with the work that I do. And it's now resulted in my spare time in well over 400 cases and increasingly focused on cellular network records. And the reason that cellular pops up here in Australia is because we have 3 different telcos. If the court wants to hear about Optus records, they could talk to Optus. But if they want to compare Telstra, Optus and Vodafone records side by side, Telstra engineers not going to be able to speak to Optus, even if they know all about it. And so I come in very much as the expert that can cross-translate the subtle differences between these networks and cross-compare, and then also be able to integrate things like and time-based evidence off a cellular device, whether it's a wearable, whether it's a phone, tablet, GPS, and be able to cross-relate those because I have that expertise, including academic publications, to be able to say, okay, this relates to that, this relates to that. And we can actually see that. One of the main skills that I find you need in court is not just having the deep technical knowledge, but also having the ability to teach and be able to explain. Strangely, I find being in the courtroom is a comfort zone because I have a class of 12 and 2 teaching assistants at the front guiding the class, right? And I can just geek out, but I've got to make sure that what I talk about is accurate, within the bounds of evidence, objective. And, my audience is the jury. It's not the book authors and the journos sitting in the courtroom. And that comes across sometimes in the Aaron Patterson trial because I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you over there. I'm talking to the jury. They're the ones that need to understand the evidence in front of them.
Yeah, because there were some comments like, oh, this is going to be a long one today because we're learning the whole existence of how cellular networks came to be and mobile base stations and everything. So it seemed like some of those comments were coming from those in the peanut gallery who thought they already knew everything about this, that, and the other.
Yeah, so, cellular networks are interesting, or cellular records are interesting because they're quite easy to read, but they're quite difficult to read accurately. They're even more difficult to be confident you're reading them accurately. And having the confidence and expertise to be able to defend your interpretation in the court is another game entirely. And so that's really where this comes from.
Yeah, and I think every examiner needs to have their line of how far they will go with those records. I look at them, I go a teeny bit in with them, and then that's about it. Like, I don't even pretend to do anything like what you do with them.
Yeah, well, and the funny thing is, if you're looking, for example, at, say, a text message database out of an iPhone, then, you could read these text messages, and you can read who they were sent from, who they were sent to. You can work out whether it's in a deleted partition of the SQLite database. But when was it sent, when was it delivered to the phone, and when was it read? Well, 3 different things. It could be all 3 different things. Yeah. And indeed, was it read, right? And so we've had a long time. So throwing back to the Myrna Nilsson case, one of the things that happened there was that the main suspect had shifted the clock in her phone by 8 days forward into and it got worse. It got worse because it crossed over the daylight savings timeline boundary, and we had cross-contaminated records through iCloud. So it was you're looking at this export out of a tool, and I won't mention Celebrite if you don't, but they had everything listed by timestamp rather than by index. And they ended up being, on the critical day, she'd fixed the clock up manually, but it was 4.5 minutes ahead. And so there's this conversation that makes no sense because the suspect and her husband are speaking where she's answering questions before they're being asked. And it was only when you go into the database, because I wasn't that experienced then, that you realize, hang on,
and then
the clock's wrong.
Then change it. Yeah. Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
So until you do.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of experience across a diverse range of cases, but also across a diverse range of technologies. So I'm brought in sometimes during an early investigation phase where police are stuck. More frequently at a point where there's a brief, goes to the court, and the prosecutors recognize that there's a gap in interpretation and they need an expert to, peer review, pull it apart, and be able to explain the evidence in court at a level that's defensible. And so that's my most frequent role, and I will always find something wrong.
So the prosecutors are hiring you more often? I mean, that's kind of where it's coming from. It's not like the local PD sort of situation?
Yeah, so the local PD pay the bill.
Or do they do it because the prosecution said you need to do this?
Yeah, that happens too, right? So that's, but it's where, I get brought in with the evidence. It's very old, very new, very complex, or very high profile. And so I don't do volume crime the most common thing that happens here is that, we have all these time zones across the country, as you do in the States. I live in a half-hour time zone, which means that I'm fairly acutely aware of the subtleties of time zone changes. But these things catch you out all the time. And one of our networks operates everything on Australian Eastern Standard Time because they made a decision in 1992 and now they're stuck with it.
Yeah.
And that catches out investigators all the time. Yeah, so understanding those subtleties and being able to confidently explain this means this means that is really critical. I do get brought in by the defence. Probably a quarter of my cases now are defence. You don't see anywhere near that many because most of the time the message back to the defence is, well, this is how screwed you are and you don't want a report from me. But when it's not, when there is a significant error or a significant alternative or a significant alibi evidence, that needs to be properly pushed through. So, I work on both sides, independent as you need to be as a subject matter expert.
So we lost Becky in post-production. Even though she was there with us live during the recording, we lost her asking the questions. So I'm going to jump in and ask all the questions that Becky asked Dr. Sorell live. Becky's question to Dr. Sorell was, you testified in the mushroom murders case, the Aaron Patterson's case. Could you share with us your involvement in the case, such as when did you get hired? What evidence were you asked to examine? Did they provide you with any information about those iNaturalist website visits? And finally, what did they want you to determine?
I didn't deal with the web browsing history. I wasn't needed. There's a perfectly good cyber team at Victoria Police that does that. My role was around the cellular network records rather than the web browser history and so on.
But did they give you any information like,
website? I'll come to that. Right. All right. So the iNaturalist website is not something I found out about until much later. I was initially given 4.5 years of call data records, and I'll come into a bit of detail there. That's quite a long time. And the question, broadly speaking, the question that was posed to me was, on which days did she visit Outram? Now, Outram is not even a town. It's a farm district with a postcode, and there is a cluster of houses at the top of the hill, but they don't form a town. It's just a postcode. And there's a number of cell towers that point in that direction. And just to complicate things, it's undulating hills and a high elevation spot where the main antenna is. And it's not that far away from where she lives. It's about 25 minutes drive in the fullness of time, but about 30 kilometers, about 20 miles away. And because it's a rural area, there's not many base stations in between. So we have on the one hand this question of when did she visit Outram over the last 4.5 years? And it was as blind as that initially. So I have these call data records and we're looking for when did she visit? And then the follow-up was we also have these signaling records, which I'll also explain in a moment. So I then had these signaling records to then burrow down on particular dates. So in addition to just having that level of detail, I also didn't have any why. Mm-hmm. Why am I doing this? And it's really important that you go into this actually quite blind, right? Yeah. If you want to be objective and you have to look at this data, you've got to actually look at it as objectively as you can. So those sort of questions do at least form a perception of bias. So you've got to be really careful. Yeah. So the other thing that I had to do was switch off the news, switch off the podcasts. This case, the public attention to this case was completely insane, unlike anything I've ever seen before. And, we have really 7 victims. We have 3 deaths. We have an attempted murder. We've got her husband who's been poisoned 3 times, apparently, prior to these murders. And of course, her children who are now the victims of these circumstances. I mean, it's just an absolutely horrific crime. And as much as you stay lighthearted in the court, it's a defense around the fact that actually what you're dealing with is really horrific. And so that'll come across, I think, in how I speak today, because I don't want to think too much about the actual crime. So 4.5 years. And really the question was, broke down to, is this an area that she visits often? Is this an area that's familiar to her? Does she go walk her dog there? Right? That sort of situation. What we had to do as a consequence was say, okay, well, here's this postcode area. Here are these 3-4 base stations that have antennas pointing into that direction. and they're not far from where she lives in Leongatha. And she used to live in Korumburra, which is about 15 minutes away as well. And we're looking for patterns of behaviour. Did she visit the Outram area? And the Outram base station shows up all the time, but on her way somewhere else. It's the sort of base station that you see, okay, I can see that you're on your way west and down to the coast, or I can see you're on the way north and into Melbourne City. But there were a number of these where she came in and went out, and we were able to show a small number where she apparently could have been visiting Outram, and one of them was the 22nd of May. But we flagged it, but we still weren't confident that she'd actually gone to a place in Outram and then come home again, because it looked like she could very well have simply been on a journey around based on her call records. So let's talk about call records now. So for your lay listeners, the ones that aren't forensic examiners, you've seen your billing record, your phone bill from your provider. And I should point out, in Australia, in the US, your cellular phone has an area code that is local to where you live, right? In Australia, it's not the case. We have a cellular numbering system beginning 04, and they're national by design. So it's quite, you can very easily distinguish a cellular number from a fixed line number, just from the phone number.
That would be so helpful to me sometimes, man.
Yeah. Well, I could give you an entire treatise on the history of cellular networks if you like, but let's not do that today.
Next podcast episode.
We can write an entire series about it. So we can see that we have 3 national networks by design. They have their own numbering code. We have mobile number portability, which means that you can take a Vodafone number and you can port it to Telstra or to Optus. We have virtual network operators, but they all sit on one of these 3 networks. So if you look at your billing record, you can see the calls that you make. You can't see the calls that came into you. Unlike the US, you don't pay for your incoming calls. I don't know if that's still the case, but it certainly was when I lived there. And you see outgoing text messages, you see outgoing calls, and you see the data connections you made. And it will give you an approximate, you were in this town when you made that call. The records that the police get that sit behind that don't come from the billing system. They come from a network database that contains, for example, for the telephone call, A party, B party, first cell, last cell. And that cell ID is not just the base station, but it's the base station and the particular transceiver. So that gives you more particulars that we can dive down to, antenna direction. And then from there, if we want it, we can get the technical details of antenna height, beam width, down tilt, so on. If we want to go that far, it will then also give you attributions. So telephone number, IMEI, which is the handset's serial number, the IMSI, which is the SIM card serial number in effect. It's not quite, but good enough. And if the other party is on the same network, you get the same details for the other party. So Telstra call to Telstra call, you'll see both parties. But you also get the intermediate switch records. So you get not just the record for your call, but you also get the data bearer set up. You also get the gateway exchange details will show up in those records. So and then if the call diverts to voicemail, you'll see that as well. So one phone call may have 1 line, it may have 3 lines, it may have 8 or 9 lines associated with that one call. So as I say, easy to read, not so easy to read accurately. It contains incoming and outgoing texts, incoming and outgoing calls, and call attempts. So if somebody tries to call you and your phone is off network, we will see that call attempt. We also have data sessions. So these days your phone is not really a telephone, it's a complex handheld computer. It still does plain old telephone calls, or at least pretends it does plain old telephone calls. It's just another service. And we see differences between when the network's using 2G or 3G technology, where it's all very circuit-centric, versus 4G and 5G technology, where it's all very voice over IP. They have different records as well. But with data sessions, a data session on the Telstra network can last anywhere from a second to 16,200 seconds, which is 4.5 hours. And I'll leave it for your technical listeners to work out why 16,200 is a nice number. But you've got a 4.5 record, potentially. And here's the subtlety. Telstra reports 1 base station for that 4.5 hour session. And if you look at the way in which the call records are assembled, it's now a non-atomic system. So back in the day, a telephone call on the cellular system was an atomic record. In other words, it had in one place, one anchor place, start time, end time, A party, B party, first cell, every cell, last cell. That entire encapsulated record goes off to the billing system, and the billing system will drag out of that first cell, last cell. It's pretty accurate. These days, a data session is now handled at the edge of the network. And so you've got these fractional call records, non-atomic, broken up. And so I start a data session at one site. I've got a session ID, the start time. I've got a start cell. And then as you move, and you move a lot because your data session is really greedy for connection. 2G data connection is, we'll hand over when we have to. 4G, 5G data connection, in fact, 4G is relevant here. We move when we want a better signal, which is all the time because we're greedy for data. And so you get lots and lots and lots of fractional records. And the billing system can't cope with that. So it gets mediated down to, I need a start time, I need an end time, I need a data volume, and I need a location. All of that information is contained in the final record. Telstra particularly just grabs the final record and says, right, that's enough to create a billing record, which is great because you now got end time and last location. But last location is not necessarily at the end time, particularly in the country. You can start a data session, do some web browsing and set it aside. And the network doesn't close down the data session. It leaves it alive for 3, 4, 4.5 hours. And there's no data being transferred. You've got no other function on your phone is calling for a data connection. And then 4.5 hours later, the network says, oh, I don't need that anymore. I'm going to shut it down. So you've got a mismatch between time and place. And that's a problem. So this is a well-known problem. Now.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever heard that mentioned in the United States, but this specifically is not my wheelhouse, so I don't follow.
Yeah, no,
it's very interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about it. Your billing system basically is designed for the network operator to make money, right? So it just needs enough information for authentication and non-repudiation, right? So we're now putting this to a secondary purpose. So the consequence of this is that when we were looking at these 4.5 years of call data records, right, we get a very sparse view of the movement behavior of that phone. If you're only making 20 phone calls a day, which is actually a lot, and you've got a data session starting every 2 hours or so, and if you're at home, your data session doesn't need to change because Wi-Fi is going to dominate your cellular connection, over your cellular connection. You don't get a really clean, high-resolution picture of the movement and behavior of the phone. So the alternative records that we have in Australia are what are called event-based monitoring. And what this is effectively every time you change the characteristics of your connection, that generates a signaling event, and we capture those. And the ones that are reported in an evidentiary manner are those that the telcos are sufficiently comfortable with as being reliable that they'll report them. Because there's a danger that you'll get a cellular signaling record that comes from a core part of the network that you want to remove from that consideration. We still get them. But the result of that is that if you are in the city, we may have 4 or 5 or 10 signaling events per minute as you walk down the street. If you're in the country and your phone is sitting on the bedside table and you don't have Wi-Fi, we may get an EBM record every 30, 40 minutes, but we can at least be satisfied that the phone's stationary. If you go to the front of the house versus the back of the house, then you might get a different cell connection, particularly if you're actively using data on your phone. When you are driving in the country, an interesting thing happens because now if your phone's just in the car, right, we will see, okay, you've connected here and then I can see you've connected there and I can see you've connected there because we're a little bit greedy as you do things. But if you're using Google Maps or Waze, I think is what you tend to use in the States, your phone's back into greedy mode and it's constantly looking for a great connection. And if you're in a hilly area, you generally see the most nearby base stations with the antennas pointing in the right direction and you can track that through. And then occasionally you'll get a base station that's 15 miles away. What's going on? So the second part of what we do is we have high resolution LiDAR mapping of the terrain of this area. And we do a simple line of sight map. Because these days we've got quite amazing processing technology with GPUs that we can do this in pretty much real time. And we can see that, okay, if you are on this road, these two nearby base stations, maybe 3-4 miles away, would cover this area, but for the fact that you're in a valley. But that base station over there, that one that's 15 miles away, that's looking straight down the valley. And so that's going to be preferred as you pass through this zone. And so now you can see that the car is in motion. Even that statically and in isolation isn't enough to say, okay, you're on that road. But you can then, when you animate that through with those cellular connections, you can actually see, okay, these connections make sense if you're on this road. And that's really important. So we came down to the 22nd of May and said, okay, there appears to be something going on here, but I can't really give it confidently. I can't eliminate the possibility that it could just be that she happens to have driven a different direction. There's line of sight. It can kind of work. But when we looked at the cellular signaling connections, it became really clear that her phone was moving because there's signals bouncing all over the place and from sometimes close, sometimes far away. And then her phone sat connected to the right sector of the Outram base station for at least 15 minutes. And then it returned to Leongatha. So we looked at that. And then a little while later, I was also asked to look at another town called Loch. Now, I didn't know why. Didn't care why. I'm not really interested in why you're interested. Loch, as it turns out, sits on the main highway between Leongatha and Melbourne City. So you can't go into the city without passing through Loch unless you try very hard to avoid it. So in this case, again, it's a town. We weren't given a particular location. There are a couple of base stations that cover into the township, but it's much easier to distinguish a passing through versus a visit because passing through will show you, okay, you've left Leongatha, you've connected to Loch, and then you've connected to these base stations that take you into Melbourne, and vice versa. But we could see these visits in and out from time to time. So far, so good. Separately, I looked at some SIM swapping over, etc., and I think we'll come to that a little bit later on. That was a different question that came up. And there were some other specific dates that then came up as well. Now, the 22nd of May ended up, let me start with, let's go 28th of April, first of all. 28th of April, we could see a visit to Loch Township. Now, I don't know, and I can't say precisely how long she was there for, but the records support that she could have been there for half an hour. And the reason that I say that is because once the phone is stationary, I don't get constant changes to the signalling record. I don't know if she went there for a coffee. I don't know whether she went there to browse a bookshop. I don't know whether she went to the local recreation park to find the oak tree to pick the death cat mushrooms. And even if she went there, I don't know if she found any.
Right.
Yeah. And then on the 22nd of May, what we have are records that show that she left home, took a 24-minute drive, ended up in Loch, spent about, I forget however many minutes there now, and then drove home again, and then stayed home for about 35 minutes, and then drove out to Outram, and then came home again. Now, as far as my evidence is concerned, that's it. Right? What I didn't know was that on the 21st of May, there'd been a posting on the iNaturalist website that death cat mushrooms had been sighted at this particular location off this particular road in Outram. So that was kind of interesting. The other thing is that with Loch, on the 28th of April, she visited Loch, and then in the afternoon, she bought a food dehydrator. That's kind of interesting.
Yep.
Right?
What will the jury infer from that information?
Well, it's spelled out to the jury, these connections. But remember, I'm just part of the picture. I'm not the investigator. I'm not the one that's synthesizing all this knowledge. I'm bringing in a certain part of the knowledge. Part of the reason why we went through 4.5 years is that we were also asked to look at specific date ranges as well, which I now know correspond to other events, which appeared to be when Simon, her husband, had been poisoned. Now, I didn't have any of that information, but there wasn't a really strong correlation between those poisoning events and the visits to these locations. And indeed, the evidence isn't clear that he was poisoned. Well, it looks like he was poisoned, but probably wasn't death cat, right? There are other toxic plants around in this area. So there could have well been a different toxin in use. We just don't know.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff that can kill you in Australia. Take your pick. Well, and see, that's kind of the other thing I wonder. Did they give you the 4+ years of records all at once? Because initially his poisoning attempts, attempted murder attempts on this strange husband were going to be part of one big case. So it seems that they probably just said, Kerchonk, here you go, look at all this stuff. But then when they initially asked you to do anything, it was just kind of at one location, then another location.
Yeah. So I think, the police already had some ideas about particular dates they wanted to look at. They'd already have a timeline, but they're now looking at, well, is this unusual behavior? So we're looking at a pattern of life type of behavior here as well.
Yep.
And of course, with that many records, you have to triage that. So you have to make some decisions about what's in and what's out, and then we could go to specific dates. And so we also had the EBM records initially. So my analyst, she's a fabulous telecommunications engineer, did the initial work only on the call charge records, and I withheld the signaling records from her. So I didn't want her to be biased to particular dates based on those. The signaling records are expensive, so you don't get them for 4.5 years. You get them for targeted dates. If I'd given those to her, then that would have just created at least a perception of bias. So we had to be careful about that. And so that's why my evidence shifted from possible visit to, this actually really does indicate a visit, is because it's that two-stage process. And that was important. And the defense picked up on it, as they rightly should. I have no issue at all with let's call it aggressiveness, but it's not really, but the aggressiveness of the defense. They are there to represent their client. They are there to poke holes in the evidence. They're there to highlight the gaps in the evidence. And that's not necessarily a competence thing, but it's, this evidence isn't black and white. It's indicative of something. It supports a proposition. There's no such thing really as proof, support for a particular proposition. So they want to highlight that. So I have no issue at all with the way in which the defense pushed their particular line of inquiry in the courtroom around that. That's what they're there to do. But they're attacking in the evidence, and that's proper.
So I think that gives us a lot of great background information on everything you had to do to kind of dig in and start, and where you ended up at some of these cities. Now, you hinted to earlier the SIM card swapping. Can we move on to that?
Sure. So,
okay. Yeah, because I guess, the question is, did you know about the SIM card swapping as you got these records? Did they tell you anything about that? Or all of a sudden you were like, what the heck happened? There's like no cellular records anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things with that. So the first thing is the records I had were only for the phone number that was definitively used by Erin over her years. And that's a phone number ending in 783. I'm not going to give you the full number, obviously. And one of the questions was to look at the SIM and the handset, the IMEI, over time. So the call records give you that. They give you the IMSI, which is the subscriber serial number. It's linked to a SIM card. And I could see that she changed her SIM card a couple of times during that period. I now know why. One of those was when she and Simon separated and she took control over her own account. And so she's swapped the SIM out. It's not unusual to have an occasional swapping of a SIM and keep the same number. I had to do exactly this last week when one of our networks, and I won't mention Optus, but realized that they can't, that my SIM wasn't going to be able to call emergency numbers. So they said, you've got to go to a store and get a new SIM. So there's reasons why that occurs. The other thing is over 4.5 years, it's not unusual to swap your handset out.
Right.
And so we see that behavior. So I didn't flag any of this as unusual or suspicious because there's plenty of innocent reasons why this happens. You drop your phone, it falls into the toilet. I've seen that happen, of course. And you've got to go find an old phone and use that for a few days while your phone gets repaired, that sort of thing. So what I hadn't realized was that the 5th of August, I didn't know, so I'm staying out of the loop. 5th of August, police were at her house conducting a search and interview. And I've got the records up in front of me. I'm not allowed to show you these. The gist of this is in the evidence, so I can talk to it. Yeah. She had a data connection on her Samsung Galaxy phone that started at just after noon, and it lasted for 8,138 seconds, which takes us to around about 2:30 p.m. But at 1:45 p.m., she got a text message came in from another Telstra customer. So I've got a record of it.
Yep.
But it wasn't delivered until 1:44 a.m. In other words, 12 hours later.
I was like, much later.
12 hours later, when it was delivered, the IMEI's changed. It's now in an older Nokia branded smartphone. Okay. Now I've seen that Nokia phone before. It had been used a year or so before for a few days. It looks like one of her phones got damaged, so she swapped it in, swapped it back out again. So this is interesting because what we've now got is a data session that opened on her phone, but it then closed a couple of hours later. It wasn't closed because the network and the phone talked to each other and said, we don't need this anymore. Closed because the network said, I haven't seen you, so I'm just going to shut you down.
Shut it down, yeah.
Now, if you switch off the Samsung phone, it will do the handshaking that says, I'm leaving now, and it will close the session.
Yep.
If you go into
nice
flight
graceful
mode,
exit.
Yeah. Flight mode, graceful exit. Flat battery, nice graceful exit. There's just enough power there to say, I'm going, see ya. Right. You pull the SIM card out or you pull the battery out, there's no graceful exit. So
just
that's
got to
what
kind of time out on the provider's end.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see this all the time. We had a case here, which was a homicide in the Victorian Alps, where our suspect's name is Greg Lynn. The victim's phone connected to the network for about 15 minutes in this remote area as the phone was in a vehicle driving past one of the ski resorts. But the data didn't time out until an hour later because the network couldn't see it anymore. There's a difference between the signaling records and the call data records. So what I've got here is that sometime between midday and 1:45 p.m., she's pulled the SIM card out of this phone, certainly done that, probably pulled the battery out as well. And we've got this text message that doesn't get delivered for 12 hours. We've got a few incoming voice calls that go straight to voicemail. And then at 1:45 a.m., her service opens up, this time on a different handset, and that text message gets delivered. So that's kind of interesting. What I didn't know at the time, but I now know, is that she handed over a different Samsung Galaxy phone to police with a different SIM card. Now, what's in evidence is that other SIM card had been used in a tablet. Now, it's really easy to tell why that is because we've got the records for that other SIM card. You just look up the IMEI, you can cross-reference the IMEI, you can see what device it was in. So I have these records of what devices her SIM card and her service has been used in over time. But this was really unusual behavior. We've never recovered the phone that she was carrying up until the 5th of August. We just don't know where it is. Well, we have a fair idea where it is, but we're not going to find it.
And that was her primary phone with a SIM ending in 783. That's the one where she just yanked it out middle of the day while the police are at her location. And then she
hands over a different phone
with a different SIM card.
Yeah. And that other phone, she'd reset multiple times, including.
Weird.
Well,
right? Like if you're going to give over a different phone, because she didn't give over the phone she was using with that SIM card, right?
But she handed over the same make and model.
But it wasn't the same phone, though.
Wasn't the same phone.
So I just don't understand, like, why would you pull your SIM card out to just... I'm just talking through it out loud.
Okay, but
give over a different phone and...
Yeah.
Instead of yanking your SIM card.
But then she continued to use her old SIM card in a different phone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That evidence actually didn't come out in my evidence in chief. Both sides forgot to raise it because it was a secondary issue, but it came up during the evidence of the main informant, so Detective Eppenstall. And so then we had a voir dire hearing about that. And I think it was decided that evidence would be given by Eppenstall. And I suspect that was agreed because had I given that evidence to the jury, it would have hit with a much harder impact as the phone expert. It would have been the same evidence, but that technical aspect of it would have had a greater psychological impact for the jury. So I'm quite comfortable with the idea that Eppenstall gave that evidence. He was also more across the other records. Remember, I had quite a narrow perspective. I didn't have the big picture. So that behavior, though, I mean, we're all, as experts in this space, we go, it's not unusual behavior, but it's really, really, really suspicious, and it's quite naive. It's quite naive behavior about covering your tracks. Look, it took a long time, and it took my analyst to do the work, and it took my developer to write some scripts to help her do the work. It's quite bespoke work there. I mean, had I done it by myself, I'd probably be still here tearing my hair out. So it required, it required the team effort. And what I really like about having young, smart people working with me is that they'll look at it a little bit differently. They'll find a different way of seeing things, and they'll raise questions about, this doesn't look right, what's going on here. So that was great. I mean, since after I gave my evidence, I then did look up where the addresses were. I mean, I didn't know where the mushroom fields were precisely until the day before my evidence, because a couple of the jury aids were the maps, which I didn't have. So I was given those and go, you're speaking to these. And it's like, okay.
Hope you know Australia well.
Yeah, well, funnily, I know this area well now. So I knew where we were, but I also didn't have her home address until I looked them up. Now, it's really easy to find a home address. It's very public, but I hadn't done that deliberately.
Sure.
But once we did, we were then able to go, all right, if she did leave from here to there, where could she have got to in between? And we can actually map the alternative routes she could have taken. And then we can overlay the line of sight radio signals and go, right, well, what fits those records? And so we can see that going from home to Outram, she had 3 or 4 different routes she could take. Only one fits. It still doesn't prove that she went to Outram. So I'm not going to put that in front of a jury. And even if she did go there, it doesn't prove that she went up this side road. It doesn't prove that she got out of the car. It doesn't prove that she found death cap mushrooms there. So it's an interesting post hoc forensic exercise, but it's not evidence I'd put in front of a jury without comprehensively enumerating all the alternative interpretations that you'd have to put there. So it's just not something I'd be prepared to put in front of a trial at this point.
What was your summary in like 2 to 3 sentences of what you told the jury was the significance of all of those records you analyzed?
Okay, so it boiled down to this. On the 28th of April, there are indications that she went to Lock. On the 22nd of May, there are indications that she went to Lock and that she went to Outram during that day. And finally, there was a SIM changeover into a different phone on the 5th of August. And that's what it really boiled down to. But of course, it took 2 days to explain that because I've also got to give a 4-year telecommunications engineering degree crash course sufficient for the jury to understand what's going on. One of the things I have to say, one of the things I really admire about barristers and judges is their ability to get their head around diverse, complex evidence. And while it gets frustrating to explain the same thing over and over again, and you've got the same judge in 4 or 5 different cases, and you think, well, you must be an imbecile, you don't need to know this. You have to review, you have to refresh as part of the evidence load. Every jury is different. I'm not allowed to speak about this jury specifically, but in general, I find that having an attentive jury that's asked, making eye contact, asking intelligent questions is a real bonus as well. I mean, this is, as I say, it's like teaching a class. You've got to make sure that you're speaking respectfully to their level and that they're able to follow it.
Yeah, I love that class analogy and teaching analogy. I love that. And now I'm going to ask you the final question of the day. Dr. Sorell, do you still eat mini beef Wellingtons and mushrooms?
I love mushrooms. Absolutely love mushrooms. And my local butcher actually does a mini beef Wellington. So yeah, occasionally one of my stepsons hates mushrooms. Won't touch it at all. Never has. But so the individual serving beef Wellingtons, yeah, no, they're a hit in my family, in the household. Yeah, we absolutely eat them. And we always have a bit of a chuckle. All right. Okay. And you're still here. So happy birthday.
Yeah. I texted Becky a picture of the menu and she's like, don't do it. And I was like, but everything else has mushrooms on it. What do I pick?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, so in the local community down in Morwell, which is where the trial was held. So we're out of the city of, Melbourne. Australia's population is very, very urbanised, far more than in the US. We're the same size as the continental US, but we've got less than 1/10 of the population. So we're very concentrated, Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth, right? So we're out in a country town that used to support coal mining industry and dairy industry. There's a fabulous Chinese restaurant I have to give a shout out because the menu I don't think has changed since 1976. Just fabulous. But they have a really interesting relationship with this trial because on the one hand, it brought a lot of attention to the town and it brought a lot of commerce, all of the eyes on the place, but they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to be remembered as being a place where this horrific murder took place. So you've got that balance happening in this township and, full respect to the local community and also, for supporting the family and Ian and his church in Leongatha as well. So, I think the community will close ranks, I think, around the local community, the victim's family as well now.
Becky and I would just like to thank Dr. Matthew Sorell again for visiting with us on this podcast episode where we were kind of digging into the cellular data logs that were part of the Aaron Patterson trial. I found the whole conversation fascinating. I myself learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot too. And as always, we want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast. As always, we truly appreciate your support and spreading the word about the work we're trying to do. Let's wrap up with, until next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and as always, keep parsing the truth one bite at a time. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us to get notified the next time a new episode drops. If you can do more, head on over to parsingthetruth.com and donate by clicking on the donate button. Parsing the Truth is a nonprofit organization, and we are raising money to send a new digital forensic examiner to IASIS training next year in Orlando. Thanks.